Marc Maron did the comedy special from Bleak to Dark. I'm Matt Noel from Gold Derby, and I wanted to kick things off, Mark, by asking you, what was one of the jokes that was more challenging to refine for that stand-up special?
Well, to land the story about visiting Lynn after she had passed away was very difficult to balance and to sort of make sure that the release of tension worked. So that took time. And the bat joke at the end, the closer, was a bit of choreographing. But I think probably those two were the most challenging and took the most work to sort of really make sure they landed.
Hmm. Now, this isn't your first time doing stand-up, Mark, but you are talking about quite personal things like the passing of Lynn. Uh, was it a different process for you in sort of working that material and getting it to a point where it's ready for a special?
I don't know if it was. I think over the last few specials, the two previous to this one, Lynn directed. But I think as time went on, when doing these hours, I I became the way I built them was similar. I would what I would do is I'd get some ideas, I'd get some stories that I would start to focus on. Then I'd do a residency at a small theater like Dynasty Typewriter here in Los Angeles, where I do several days over a period of weeks to just improvise through the ideas and the stories until they started to take shape. So I would kind of riff out hour and a half, 2 hours, and see what stuff started to stick. And when I was talking about Lynn passing early on, it was very emotional, but my audience knew that I was workshopping stuff and moving through the feelings of it and trying to put something together. And then what happens is I take it on the road for this was I was taking most of this stuff out for a year and a half, probably, if not a little longer, right when we were able to start working post COVID. And then as I kind of we get closer to the day of the special, sometimes really just days, maybe a week, I kind of I kind of edit down from an hour and a half, hour 45 to get that you know, whatever, like 65, 70 minutes, and to find the through line, to figure out if there are callbacks, and just to take out anything that seems redundant. That happens in the last week or two, which makes it very fresh because I'm literally entering the special with material that I have done for a year and a half at that point, but it's sequenced differently, or there are pieces of it missing, and I leave a little room to improvise. So, but that's the way I've done the last few specials.
Is there anything you learned from this particular set you learnt from the audience?
Well, I learned that the night that I shot that special, the first audience was very excited, too excited. And, I was kind of like, a little hyper. It was a great show, the first show, but we taped two. And the second show was actually more challenging in that they were a real audience that I felt like I had to kind of win over. They were my audience, but they weren't just excited to be there or feeling excited to be part of it in the same way. And that's really the one we took from. If there's anything I learned, it's just a matter of deliberate pacing. And I've always been, the laugh is important, but I'm not a guy that's necessarily gunning for easy laughs. So it was really, if I learned anything, was that they'll pay attention, and they'll go along with me, and they'll take what I do in as a performance as opposed to some sort of night out or something, which was always the intention.
Is there anything like when you're writing about stuff that's personal, stuff about Lynn, stuff about your parents, and you're working through that material, are there things you learn about yourself and things you learn about the people in your life and things that you learn from doing that and sort of putting it under that microscope?
Yeah, I think so. I think that over the years, in talking about my parents, things have shifted. I've grown more accepting and less angry, and then even jokes that refer to being, angry or less accepting, they're grounded in a, I think, and coming from a more loving place, and they're more relatable that way, as opposed to just experiencing kind of uncontrolled feelings. I think that ultimately, with all the work that I do that's personal, which is most of it, it's kind of coming to work towards coming from a grounded place as opposed to being reactive. And the stuff about Lynn was really part of, my grieving
Mm.
process, and trying to put that into perspective, and trying to understand what those feelings were, and that they weren't, really manageable feelings, but they were, I think, very common feelings, and not talked about that much. So I think through that process, that material around Lynn was essential to me in processing her passing. So yeah, learning how to grieve, and learning how to share that experience.
Mm. You did say that, like, you did do a bit where you go, didn't know how I was going to talk about this. Could have done a TED talk,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Right, yeah,
could have done a sadder thing, all that sort of stuff. And you
yeah,
said you came to the realization that if you need to talk about it in a funny way, it will happen at some point if it's necessary. And then you added, which it always is.
yeah.
And why for you do you think it's always necessary, or what was that sort of like line coming from to talk about stuff like this in a funny way?
Well, I think that goes back to, it's sort of a through line to all my stand-up work, is that, when I was a kid, I looked to stand-ups to kind of contextualize the world, to make sense of things, and to disarm things that seemed too overwhelming to really understand, or to wrap my brain around. I think that something that comics can do is in a fairly sort of incisive and quick way, disarm a lot of things, like,
Mm,
fear, sadness, confusion. I mean, it's a way of managing feelings and emotions in a very specific uh, um, craft to it.
mm,
That, so I always feel that there's very little that can't be joked about, and a lot of times it puts things into perspective for people in a way that enables them to manage the feelings around that stuff a little easier, and feel less alone with it, or whatever it is, or just get the relief, from things that seem, impossible to overcome or too overwhelming. It's always been part of what I do, and my intention.
yeah. Like, and you talk about that bit in the show actually, and like I was thinking, is it different, that like sort of power of comedy to disarm, when you're sort of growing up watching comedy, you're an audience member, and the way you sort of, it helps disarm the scary and the confusing
Yeah.
when you're actually the one performing it and writing the material.
Well, there really are, to me, like, I can see the the influence of my heroes in my work, and and sometimes more clearly than others. But these last two specials, uh, I can definitely see how they influence me. And as a performer, there's a cathartic connection with the moment that I know I felt that I disarmed something, or I overcame something, or I was able to put the feelings into a humorous context that was elevating. So I feel those moments because I'm the guy that thought of them, and
Mm,
they helped me first. So when it all happens with the audience, and it happens together, you feel seen, you feel received, you feel like you've done your job, you feel like you've blown some minds, so that becomes a kind of a mutual experience between me and the audience. And it doesn't, none of this material, I never got tired of any of it.
mm. Oh, that's good. Do you have a what was one of the comics that, when before, like, you were growing up, that helped you most make sense of the world and disarm the scary?
Well, I think that, sometimes it was very simple. Sometimes when I was very young, just people that were funny, Don Rickles, Jackie Vernon was very important to me when I was a kid for some reason. A lot of the people that were still alive, still on TV, Buddy Hackett, Rodney Dangerfield. I used to read, there was a magazine that used to come with the paper called Parade Magazine. And in the last page of Parade Magazine was my favorite jokes. And it was always featured every week. It featured a comedian with just their jokes. And I remember reading it every week, and just it kind of wired my brain a certain way. But as I got older, it was an odd bunch. When I saw Pryor's first movie live in concert when I was in high school, when it came out, it was pretty mind blowing. And I don't know that I could really sense why it was mind blowing or what it was, but this was a guy talking about, some lighthearted stuff, but also some, painfully difficult things, not just about race, but about, his own behavior in such a way that exuded a type of vulnerability that you really don't see that often. I think that had a big effect on me. Carlin was sort of off to the side with me, but what other records did I have? I used to listen to Cheech and Chong, for God's sakes. I was just always watching stand-ups whenever I could on TV. Saturday Night Live was important to me. And I think Woody Allen early on was a pretty big deal, and Richard Lewis too.
Mm. It's interesting how you sort of talked about how you are sort of through your work you're able to sort of make sense of things, and how maybe those sort of early comics and just your exposure to comedy gave you the tools to be able to process things as a adult
Yeah.
that sort of dealing with grief and suffering and things that are hard.
Well, yeah, I think that you have to. I mean, I think if you can't find humor in it, the possibility that you'll isolate and that it will sort of maybe, kind of spread in your brain and ruin the rest of whatever you have up there is a big possibility. And but also, like, getting back to the other question, like in
Mm,
these last two, like this one was structured in a very specific way that, because as I got older, I spent time with some real monsters and maniacs as comics, when I was a doorman at the Comedy Store with dealing with Sam Kinison and what, he brought to the table. And, I grew to appreciate Bill Hicks. And, when many years ago before he died, I'd spent time with him. But I see that, like, in this special, there's fairly distinct sections of it that was part of me putting it together. And I felt like, in order to honor the legacy that I feel that I'm part of in terms of cultural commentary and jarring cultural commentary, that first 15 to 20 minutes is really doing that, around the religious jokes, around the abortion jokes, around dealing with, the anti-woke movement, and then, sort of shifting into, the grief section, which was hyper personal and frighteningly vulnerable. And then the last section is really just my own kind of personal place in the world type of stuff around kids and my own neurotic sensibilities and depression or what have you. So, I can see where I pulled, from my heroes in the sense of, like, Hicks looms large, I think, in that first section. And then, Pryor also looms large, along with some of the more shticky Jewish comedians in, the second and third sections. But I can see what made me.
mm. And like I think it is so interesting because the beginning does start like you're right out of the gate, like sort of this world is like a
Yeah,
bleak place. Like there's
yeah,
a lot to be scared of. There's a lot of bad stuff. You do your one man show talking about,
yeah,
where the
yeah, yeah,
world's going, like climate change.
yeah,
And it does put the more personal grief and tragedy in the context of a world full of a lot to be
yeah.
scared of, and a world, a lot of things. Um, do you think that helped prepare the audience in a way where,
Well, I
like,
think my audience in particular, that, there's so many things unsaid about the things that are out of our control, um, and also the political realities of the world we live in, or this country we live in. I don't think this is essentially a political special in any way, but there are certain things around what's going on in terms of nationalism and fascism and stuff, that I don't think people really frame up, as succinctly or at all in the general conversation. But my audience was certainly prepared for it. Climate stuff and all that stuff was like, how do I place myself, in the face of that, get a few laughs, realize that some of it's out of my control, but some of it is certainly within my control to talk about and raise awareness about. But I think that most of my audience and people in general and people who have come to the special are sort of relieved that I put it so bluntly. And it is funny, but it's a sort of ironic funny because we know things are happening, but we don't really feel like there's anything we can do about a lot of them. And we're sitting in this, this weird, dark time.
Yeah.
So by the time I get to Lynn, that is something that we all experience that is completely human, not necessarily manageable, but a shared experience and just part of the basic humanity of what we go through. So I don't know that it's set it up,
Mm.
but oddly, that now that we're talking about it, it is a more manageable darkness because it is something human beings are all going to have to reckon with somehow: grief and loss and tragedy. But that turns out to be really the sort of most manageable bit of darkness in that special.
Yeah, and something that's like universal. People have been
Yeah,
dealing with since the beginning of time. Where some of the challenges we're facing today, we feel like, oh, people have never had to deal with this stuff
that's right.
before. But
Right.
some of the stuff we find the hardest is stuff that humanity has always had to deal with and always
That's
been
right.
out of control of. Yeah,
That's right. Inevitable.
yeah. I think also the stuff with like oh, what was I going to say with like all the climate and all that sort of bad stuff that is sort of starting off with the world's bad. Like there is something funny about sort of not pussyfooting around stuff that people
Right.
often pussyfoot and beat around the bush. Just bluntly go, things are bad. Not sure if there's anything we can do about it. And I think there's
Right.
that bluntness is really fun.
Well, I think that's what we were talking about before, that it is the core of framing something in a way where people feel less alone and get a laugh out of it. But because everything is so dire in a way, just saying it out loud and just admitting that, there's probably nothing we can do is strangely hilarious.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Because like I think it sort of strips away the sort of veneer of protection, or the sort of like, oh,
Right.
let's just pretend this isn't happening, and like it
Yeah.
draws attention. I think it draws attention to the fact that people are pretending it's not happening, which is
Well, I
sort of
think
a bit
that, yeah,
absurd.
it's a necessary denial. And
Yeah,
it's weird. It's very weird because I think about it all the time with these fires, like, like Canada is on fire. And, we had it here for a couple of years, just massive fires. And it's just a reality. Uh, and it's obviously awful and it's obviously new, but it's just something that we live with now.
mhm,
And I don't think people are necessarily in denial about it, but but our ability to adapt to things can be a little frightening, and I think that it's necessary to sort of be jarring about the reality of it so people connect to their feelings a little bit, because God knows what kind of horrors can happen if they just slip in and people get used to them.
yeah. What's the funniest joke for you in the special, or one of them? I know it's hard to choose, but like, what's one of the funniest moments for you in the special?
I love the reference to the Samuel French Publishing Company. It's just a very weird little reference about publishing the one-man show, and it's a very specific thing that only people that have, taken acting classes or have been in plays know about. And also, there's a strange, very, very sort of old school delivered joke that really happened only twice. Maybe once before the night of the special, and it's kind of gnarly, and it's a bit sort of, it's not crass, but it's a little bit rough. But the joke that I used to transition out of the first section into the second section, which is, the day Lynn died was the worst day of my life, was the worst day of my life, and I'm sure for her as well. That,
Yeah,
it's very kind of jarring, but the logic is correct. It may feel insensitive, but the timing of it and the shock of the way it's framed, which is really classic one-liner, uh, really serves to kind of, you know, open that door into talking about it in a deeper way. And I like the way that worked. It's questionable in its tone, but I think it was the perfect thing to happen. And it was literally the second time I did it was the night of the
Oh,
special.
it's so dark, but at the same time, it's almost something you could imagine. Like the sort of tone of it is almost like a Steve Martin-ish tone, where it's sort
Yeah,
of like it's
it's
this
like
map.
it's probably
Yeah,
a little older. It's probably a
yeah,
little
yeah,
like
yeah.
it's a
So
little more Jewish. It's a little
yeah,
more
yeah. No, that's
boo
fair.
bada bing. You know what I
Yeah, yeah,
mean?
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, you're right
Yeah,
about
yeah.
that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Oh, Mark, thanks so much for chatting with us today. All the best of luck with the upcoming Emmy Awards. People can go to goldderby.com to follow the Emmy Awards on our site. And Mark, it's always so much fun talking comedy with you.
Great to see you, man. Thanks a lot.